"That kid will never make it," said veteran coach Bill Thompson as he watched 16-year-old Shai Gilgeous-Alexander struggle through a disastrous high school tryout in 2017. Bill had been coaching basketball for 35 years and thought he could spot future stars, but he cut Shai from the team without a second thought. 7 years later, Bill was watching on TV as Shai accepted his second MVP award, realizing he had made the biggest mistake of his coaching career, and that sometimes the players who look least ready are the ones who want it most. The date was September 12, 2017. Bill Thompson stood on the sideline of Hamilton Heights Christian Academy's gymnasium in Chattanooga, Tennessee, clipboard in hand, watching the final day of varsity basketball tryouts with the critical eye of someone who had been evaluating young talent for over 3 decades. At 58 years old, Bill had coached high school basketball since 1982, leading teams to 4 state championships and sending dozens of players to college programs. He prided himself on identifying potential NBA talent early. 3 of his former players had been drafted over the years, and several others had received Division I scholarships. Bill's evaluation process was systematic and unforgiving. He looked for specific physical attributes, fundamental skills, and competitive instincts that he believed were necessary for elite basketball success. Players who didn't meet his standards were cut quickly and definitively. Among the 30 hopefuls trying out for the team was Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, a lanky 16-year-old who had transferred to Hamilton Heights from a school in Ontario, Canada. At 6 feet 5 inches and barely 170 pounds, Shai looked more like a junior varsity prospect than a varsity candidate. Bill watched Shai struggle through the tryout drills with growing skepticism. His ball handling was inconsistent, his shooting form was unpolished, and his understanding of complex offensive sets seemed limited. Most concerning to Bill was Shai's apparent lack of assertiveness. He rarely demanded the ball and seemed hesitant to take challenging shots. "Thompson, what do you think about the Canadian kid?" asked assistant coach Mike Stevens during a break between drills. Bill glanced at Shai, who was quietly practicing free throws while other players socialized. "Kid's got height, but that's about it. No strength, no polish, no killer instinct. He plays like he's afraid to make mistakes." Mike nodded, trusting Bill's judgment after years of successful player evaluation. "So he's a cut?" "Definitely," Bill replied without hesitation. "I've seen 1,000 kids like him, physically gifted but mentally soft. He might develop into a decent player eventually, but he's not ready for our level of competition." But what Bill didn't recognize was that he was observing someone whose greatest strengths couldn't be measured by traditional basketball metrics. Shai's apparent hesitation wasn't fear, it was careful observation. While other players rushed through drills to showcase their athleticism, Shai was studying the nuances of each exercise, analyzing how successful players approached different situations, and mentally cataloging information that would inform his development. His reluctance to force shots wasn't lack of confidence, it was basketball IQ. Shai understood that trying to impress coaches with low percentage attempts would ultimately hurt both his individual performance and team success. His quiet demeanor wasn't weakness, it was maturity. At 16, Shai had already learned that leadership often meant listening, learning, and earning respect through consistent effort rather than vocal demands for attention. But Bill Thompson, despite his decades of experience, was evaluating Shai based on outdated assumptions about what young basketball talent should look like. After the final tryout session, Bill posted the roster outside his office. Shai's name was not included among the 15 players selected for the varsity team. Several parents and players were shocked by the decision, but Bill was confident in his evaluation. "Coach Thompson, are you sure about cutting Shai?" asked Janet Martinez, the school's athletic director. "I know his stats weren't impressive today, but several people have told me he has tremendous work ethic and basketball IQ." Bill's response revealed the limitations of his traditional evaluation approach. "Janet, I've been coaching for 35 years. I know what varsity-level talent looks like, and that kid doesn't have it. He might make a decent JV player if he puts in work, but he'll never compete at the highest levels." Janet accepted Bill's decision, trusting his experience and track record of successful player development. However, what happened during the following months would begin to reveal the profound mistake Bill had made in his assessment of Shai's potential. Shai, rather than being discouraged by the rejection, used it as motivation to accelerate his development. He began training with private coaches, studying game film obsessively, and developing the systematic approach to improvement that would eventually make him an NBA superstar. "Coach Thompson made it clear that I wasn't ready for varsity basketball," Shai told his father, Vaughn, after receiving the news. "So I'm going to make sure that by next season, there's no question about my readiness." Shai transferred to another school where he could get more playing time and development opportunities. Within 6 months, his improvement was so dramatic that college scouts began taking notice of the young Canadian who seemed to get better every week. But Bill Thompson, focused on coaching his selected roster, remained unaware of Shai's rapid development and growing reputation among basketball evaluators. Bill's team had a successful season, making it to the state semifinals before losing to a more talented opponent. He was satisfied with his roster decisions and convinced that cutting Shai had been the right choice based on the information available during tryouts. It wasn't until 2 years later that Bill first realized the magnitude of his evaluation error. However, what happened when Bill discovered Shai's college and professional success would force him to confront fundamental flaws in his approach to identifying and developing young talent. In 2019, Bill was watching the NBA draft with his family when he heard Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's name called as the 11th overall pick. The television broadcast included highlights of Shai's college career and interviews about his rapid development from unknown prospect to lottery selection. "Dad, didn't you coach that guy in high school?" asked Bill's son, Kevin, who remembered the Hamilton Heights tryouts from 2 years earlier. Bill stared at the television in shock. "No, I cut him from the team. I thought he wasn't ready for varsity basketball." The reality of his mistake hit Bill like a physical blow. The player he had dismissed as lacking potential was now being drafted into the NBA after just 2 years of college basketball. Bill immediately began researching Shai's development trajectory, trying to understand how he had so completely misjudged someone who was clearly capable of elite-level performance. What he discovered was both humbling and educational. Every coach who had worked with Shai after high school praised his work ethic, basketball IQ, and leadership qualities, exactly the attributes that Bill had failed to recognize during tryouts. "Thompson, you've got to see this," Mike Stevens said, showing Bill an article about Shai's college coach praising his mental approach to the game. "This kid's coach at Kentucky says he's the most coachable player he's ever worked with. How did we miss that?" Bill read the article with growing dismay. College coaches described Shai as someone who arrived early, stayed late, asked thoughtful questions, and constantly sought ways to improve his game, characteristics that should have been obvious to an experienced evaluator. But what troubled Bill most was realizing that he had evaluated Shai based on immediate performance rather than potential for growth and development. However, what happened when Bill tried to analyze his evaluation mistakes would lead to a complete transformation of his coaching philosophy and player development approach. Bill spent weeks reviewing his notes from Shai's tryout, trying to understand where his assessment had gone wrong. He began to realize that his evaluation criteria had been focused on current skill level rather than capacity for improvement. "I was looking for players who were already good," Bill reflected during a conversation with his wife, Sandra. "But the players who become great are usually the ones who aren't satisfied with being just good." Bill recognized that Shai's apparent weaknesses during tryouts, hesitation, careful decision-making, quiet observation, were actually indicators of a growth mindset and systematic approach to improvement. The kid wasn't playing carelessly because he was afraid to make mistakes, Bill realized. He was playing thoughtfully because he understood that every decision was a learning opportunity. This revelation forced Bill to reconsider not just his evaluation of Shai, but his entire approach to identifying and developing young talent. Bill began studying the backgrounds of players who had exceeded expectations at college and professional levels, looking for common characteristics that traditional evaluation methods might miss. What he discovered was that many elite players had been overlooked or undervalued early in their careers, not because they lacked talent, but because their talent manifested in ways that conventional assessment didn't recognize. "Sandra, I think I've been coaching wrong for 35 years, Bill told his wife during one of their evening conversations. "I've been selecting players based on what they could do, not who they were as competitors and learners." But what Bill decided to do with this newfound understanding would transform not only his own coaching effectiveness but his entire legacy in basketball education. Bill completely restructured his evaluation process, placing equal emphasis on work ethic, coachability, and growth potential alongside traditional athletic metrics. He began looking for players who demonstrated curiosity, persistence, and genuine love for improvement rather than just current skill level. The results were immediate and dramatic. Bill's next recruiting class included several players who had been overlooked by other programs but possessed the character traits and growth mindset that he now recognized as crucial for long-term success. Within 2 years, Bill's teams were not only more successful on the court but were sending more players to college programs than ever before in his career. "Coach Thompson, what changed?" asked Sarah Wilson, a sports reporter who had covered Bill's teams for over a decade. Your player development has reached a completely different level. Bill's response revealed how much his encounter with evaluating Shai had changed his fundamental understanding of coaching. I learned that my job isn't to select the best players, it's to develop the players who want to become their best. Bill described his new approach to recruiting and development, which prioritized character, work ethic, and growth potential over immediate physical capabilities. I used to cut players who weren't ready. Now I focus on identifying players who are willing to get ready. However, the most meaningful validation of Bill's transformed approach came when he received an unexpected phone call 3 years after Shai's NBA debut. "Coach Thompson, this is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I know you probably don't remember me, but I tried out for your team at Hamilton Heights back in 2017. Bill was stunned to hear from Shai and immediately felt a mixture of regret and curiosity about why the NBA star was calling him. "Shai, of course I remember you. I owe you an apology for not recognizing your potential during those tryouts." Shai's response surprised Bill. "Coach Thompson, I'm not calling about an apology. I'm calling to thank you." Bill was confused. "Thank me? For cutting you from the team?" Shai explained that being cut from Bill's team had been a crucial turning point in his development, forcing him to develop the systematic approach to improvement that had ultimately enabled his professional success. "Coach, when you cut me, it taught me that potential doesn't matter if you can't demonstrate it. That lesson motivated me to develop the work ethic and attention to detail that made everything else possible." Shai described how the rejection had eliminated any sense of entitlement and replaced it with hunger for continuous improvement that had sustained him through college and professional basketball. "I needed to learn that nobody owes you opportunities, you have to earn them every day. Getting cut from your team taught me that lesson when I was young enough to use it." But what Shai proposed during the rest of their conversation would create an opportunity for both of them to impact young players in ways neither had anticipated. "Coach Thompson, I've heard about the changes you've made to your program and how you're now focused on developing character alongside basketball skills. I'd like to partner with you on creating a camp for players who have been overlooked or underestimated." Shai explained his vision for a development program that would combine elite basketball training with character development and mental preparation for players who had potential but needed guidance and opportunity. "We could create something for kids like I was, players who have ability but need someone to believe in their capacity for growth." The partnership between Bill and Shai resulted in the Second Chance Basketball Academy, a summer program that provided intensive training and mentorship for players who had been cut from teams, overlooked by recruiters, or told they weren't good enough for higher levels of competition. Bill served as the program's head of player development, while Shai provided funding and served as a mentor and inspiration for participants who were facing the same doubts and challenges he had experienced. The Academy's first summer included 40 players from across the country, many of whom had been discouraged by previous evaluations or rejections but possessed the character traits and work ethic necessary for significant improvement. However, the most important outcome of the Academy wasn't the number of players who earned college scholarships or professional opportunities, it was the lesson it taught about potential, evaluation, and the importance of never giving up on young people who demonstrate character and commitment. During the Academy's graduation ceremony, Bill reflected on how his mistake with Shai had led to a completely new understanding of his role as a coach and mentor. "7 years ago, I made the biggest evaluation error of my coaching career," Bill told the audience of players, parents, and fellow coaches. "I cut a player who would become an NBA MVP because I was looking for the wrong qualities and measuring the wrong attributes." Bill described how that mistake had taught him that coaching wasn't about selecting talent, it was about developing character, work ethic, and the mental tools necessary for sustained improvement. "The greatest players aren't always the ones who look the best on the first day. They're the ones who are willing to do whatever it takes to look better on the last day." As Bill watched the Academy graduates prepare for their next seasons with renewed confidence and systematic approaches to improvement, he realized that his evaluation mistake with Shai had ultimately become the most valuable learning experience of his coaching career. The coach who never coached Shai had learned that sometimes the most important lessons come from the players who teach you to see potential differently, measure success more broadly, and understand that the greatest victories often happen when you help someone else discover what they're truly capable of achieving. And in gymnasiums across the country, where young players who had been told they weren't good enough were now developing the skills and character necessary for success, they understood that sometimes the most transformative coaching happens when experienced teachers are humble enough to learn from their mistakes and wise enough to use those lessons to help others overcome similar challenges. Bill Thompson had discovered that the player who got away had actually become the teacher who helped him find his true purpose as a developer of not just basketball players, but confident, resilient young people who understood that being cut was just the beginning of the most important part of their journey.